Marriage is a bedrock institution in most cultures, including in our own. We spend a lot of time talking about marriage, planning our weddings, debating with our partners and friends about whether we're ready for marriage. How will we know? Will we ever be? Will he pop the question? Will she say yes? But what is marriage? What marriage is, what it's even for, depends on who you ask. Is it an institution for the granting of special legal rights, privileging couples who have solemnized or solidified their relationships in certain ways over those who have not? Is it an institution for regulating the ownership and transfer of property? Is it a spiritual contract between two people and their God or gods? A social contract between two people and their community? A private emotional contract between two people? Is it just a reason to have a big party and get gifts? Or is it a way to achieve adult status, or maybe even to become sexually active without fear of disapproval or judgment? So, from a sociological perspective, what is marriage exactly? No one definition of marriage applies to all cultures and all time periods, but a survey of the institution globally and historically suggests a range of different functions. For example, in the past, marriage was used to ensure the legal and social legitimacy of children. This isn't something we care about so much anymore. With the advent of modern DNA testing and court-ordered child support, we no longer have to use marriage to a child's mother as legal proof of paternity, for example. However, establishing an orderly process of inheritance is something that we still use marriage for. Many rights of inheritance are still linked to marriage, with spouses having primary rights over a deceased person's estate. Marriage can be used to solidify family and kin networks. In the past, it was also used to transfer authority over women from one man to another, and ownership of her property from one man to another too. This is the principle of coverture that we talked about before. In modern industrialized nations, this particular function of marriage has fallen out of favor, since women are now considered mature and agentic enough to make our own decisions and support ourselves, but it may still be recognized as a function in some places. Marriage may grant someone exclusive sexual access or rights to the labor products of their husband or wife. Most American couples still see marriage as a pledge of monogamy, but not all. It can be used to solidify joint partnership or to create a new household bound by both rights and obligations. It can be used to symbolize the creation of a new family unit aimed at rearing or caring for children and other dependents. It can be a contract or a promise to remain coupled for life. And it can also exist as a way to formally sanction a romantic or sexual union by a religious authority, like a church. Finally, of course, in the modern era especially, marriage is considered to be an expression of love between two people. Further complicating the definition of marriage is the fact that in a country like the United States, it exists in two forms. We have a distinction between civil marriage and religious marriage. Civil marriage is a marriage solemnized as a civil contract without a religious ceremony. Civil marriages are often performed at the courthouse, for example, by a justice of the peace. All legal benefits of marriage are tied to this, to marriage as a civil institution. We'll talk about that in a second. The second kind of marriage is a religious marriage, which refers to the act of saying vows in a church, temple, or mosque, or the special recognition granted to a couple by their relevant religious authority, like their imam or their priest or their rabbi. Many American marriages exist simultaneously as both civil and religious marriages, but not all. Almost all religious marriages in the United States are also recognized as civil contracts or institutions, but not all civil marriages are religious marriages, meaning you can have a purely civil marriage by going to the courthouse and being married by a justice of the peace. It doesn't have to happen in or be recognized by a church. There are also examples of religious marriages that were not recognized as civil marriages. For example, before the legalization of gay marriage in all 50 states by the Obergefell v. Hodges decision in 2015, many churches would perform religious marriage ceremonies for same-sex couples, but these were not always recognized by the states in which they resided. Purely civil marriages are becoming more common in the United States. Among the 14 states that kept track of purely civil or justice of the peace marriages in 2001, about 40% of couples, so almost half, opted only for the civil marriage, i.e., they did not choose to say their vows in a house of worship or have them solemnized by clergy. Even if you do have a religious marriage in the United States, the state, the civil side, still gets involved. You still have to go to the courthouse to get a license, and then you have that license signed by the person who officiated, for example, the clergy member, and mail it back to the state. So, for many of us, both civil and religious marriages exist hand in hand. By the way, the debate about gay marriage in the United States only referred to granting the right to civil marriage. No house of worship, no church, temple, or mosque can be forced by the government to perform marriages for anyone it doesn't want to. And houses of worship can refuse to perform marriages for all kinds of people, people who aren't members of the church, for example, or it can refuse to perform marriages for interfaith couples. So the debate over gay marriage was about the right to extend civil marriage and its benefits to gay or same-sex couples. What are the legal rights and benefits attached to marriage as a civil institution? Well, there are a lot of them, and this is one reason why so many people were fighting for the right to include gays and lesbians in the institution of marriage. Because people, even people who had been cohabiting with a partner for decades in some cases, were shut out of most of the benefits that were extended to heterosexual married couples automatically. Marriage entitles couples to federal benefits as well as state-level and employer-based benefits. For example, a married person has automatic access to their spouse's Social Security, veterans benefits, and insurance coverage. If you are married to someone, for example, and that person gets insurance through their employer, you are automatically entitled to be covered too. Marriage opens the ability to secure spousal visas for immigration and to adopt jointly. It also provides for next of kin designation for medical and legal decisions, the right of visitation in the hospital, and inheritance. One of the biggest benefits of marriage, though, and probably the least romantic of all of them, is that marriage entitles people to the right to divorce, or dissolution and divorce protections. It might seem counterintuitive that one of the big benefits of marriage is the right to get a divorce, but it makes sense if you think about it. People who live together for years or decades acquire a lot of assets in common. If that marriage should dissolve, those assets need to be divided. In that case, being married entitles a couple to a neutral third party, in this case a divorce court or the state, who will step in and arbitrate that division of assets, making sure that nobody gets shut out completely. In cases where one partner is the primary breadwinner, for example, one partner works full-time while the other decides to stay home and devote his or her life to keeping the house and raising the children, divorce protections also make certain that the person who was not a primary wage earner isn't completely left impoverished, that that person's contribution to the household is recognized in the division of assets, even though he or she wasn't necessarily bringing in a paycheck. Divorce is basically a court decree that terminates a marriage. The divorce decree establishes new relations between the parties, including all obligations related to shared assets and debt, spousal support, and provisions for the custody of children. This can be harder than it looks. In a community property state like Texas, each spouse has half ownership of assets and debts acquired during the marriage, even if only one partner paid for them or ran them up. Which means if the couple and their lawyers can't come to an agreement about what to do with a house bought during a marriage, a judge will need to step in and make a ruling regarding whether the house should be sold and the profits divided, or whether one partner should buy the other out. For other assets, no matter how small or weird, they might be divided in open court. This rather famous picture from the 1990s shows a couple dividing their Beanie Baby collection, valued at the time to be worth between $2,500 and $5,000 in court. The couple were unable to come to a mutual understanding about Beanie Baby custody, so the collection was ordered spread out on the courtroom floor and divided up one by one under the supervision of a family court judge. Marriage isn't the only form that relationships between romantically involved adults can take, of course. We see a range of kinds of relationship measured mostly by the kinds of commitment or stability that they offer. On one end is what we call a pure relationship. A pure relationship is an intimate relationship entered into for its own sake, and which only lasts so long as both partners are satisfied with it. Most dating relationships fall into this category. Next, your reading defines something called a union, sometimes called a consensual union. This is a cohabiting relationship, a relationship in which the couple live together and may consider themselves to be married, but have never had a civil or religious marriage ceremony. They've never put it on paper. Ken and Barbie's relationship probably existed between the pure relationship and consensual union status. By the way, in 2004, Mattel Incorporated issued a press release announcing that Barbie and Ken were breaking up after 43 years of dating. Russell Aarons, vice president of marketing at Mattel, said that Barbie and Ken feel like it's time to spend some quality time apart. Like other celebrity couples, their Hollywood romance has come to an end, said Aarons, who quickly added that the duo will remain friends. Aarons hinted in an interview with the Associated Press that the separation may be partially due to Ken's reluctance to get married. All of those bridal Barbie dolls and toy chests around the globe, he said, are really just examples of Barbie's wishful thinking. Mattel then announced that they were manufacturing a new boyfriend for Barbie, an Australian surfer doll named Blaine. Not all couples and relationships live together or cohabit. Almost all couples begin as a living apart relationship, a relationship in which two people define themselves as a couple but do not live together. Sometimes living apart relationships will evolve into cohabiting relationships or marriages, but not always. For example, people with children from earlier relationships will, after a divorce or breakup, often try to take things slowly when entering a new dating relationship, pursuing living apart relationships in some cases for years, while they maintain their primary household with their children. For many couples, the first step in establishing a relationship is creating an understanding that the relationship will be monogamous, meaning sexually or romantically faithful to only one person at a time. Most married couples also expect that their union will be based on the foundation of sexual and romantic monogamy. Wedding vows usually still include some phrase wherein the bride or groom promises to forsake all others, for example. When this pledge is broken, and unfortunately it sometimes is, we call that cheating or adultery, and most of us see that as a justifiable or even non-negotiable reason to end a relationship or even a marriage. Not all couples practice monogamy, however. Some couples embrace what's called polyamory, which is defined as having an open relationship, or having intimate relationships with more than one partner at the same time, with the knowledge and consent of all involved. This is different from cheating, in which somebody pursues multiple sexual and romantic relationships behind their primary partner's back. Scottish actress Tilda Swinton, shown here, is an example of a fairly well-known person who has opted to pursue this particular kind of living arrangement. She cohabits with both the father of her children, playwright John Byrne, and her boyfriend, artist Sandro Cobb, who himself has an additional girlfriend outside the household. This kind of relationship isn't for everyone. Cobb is pictured here with Swinton, by the way. But Swinton described herself as deeply in love with both men, reports that they share childcare duties as a triad, and that they are all very happy and very close friends. One thing that has probably changed the most about marriage, and this was discussed in earlier lectures, is that while most people will eventually marry, we are taking longer to do so, and marriage is far more likely to be preceded by cohabitation than it was in the past. Only half of all adults, 52%, are currently married, down from 72% in 1960. Among 20-somethings, that has declined even more dramatically, from 68% of people in their 20s being married in 1960 to only 26% today. Gay and lesbian couples are still less likely to be married than heterosexual couples are. This may be partially accounted for by the fact that gay marriage wasn't even an option in most American states until 2015. About 1 in 10 gay and lesbian couples are now married. Among cohabiting gay couples, about 61% are married, up from 38% before the Obergefell ruling in 2015, which extended gay marriage rights to all states. We saw a big spike in same-sex marriages after states, beginning with Massachusetts in 2003, began legalizing them piecemeal, and then again in 2015 after Obergefell versus Hodges. Couples who had been together for decades, like Jane Abbott Lightly and her wife P.B. Peterson of Washington State, celebrated their newfound ability to formalize their unions by getting marriage licenses in large numbers. What do we know about gay married couples? Well, most of the research tells us that GLBT couples are similar to heterosexual couples in most respects. They report similar motivations for marriage that straight couples do, being more likely to list being in love than any other factor. And they tend to fight about exactly the same things: money, sex, child rearing, division of chores, etc. The data do indicate that GLBT couples may be more egalitarian than straight couples, tending to split domestic chores and decision-making power more equally. That might not be surprising, since housework, for example, remains a very gendered behavior in many households. That wouldn't necessarily translate to a same-sex couple. It's very hard, if you're both men, to argue that you shouldn't have to be the one to do the housework because that's quote-unquote women's work, for example. Also, gay and lesbian couples do in many cases raise children, but not to the same extent that heterosexual couples do. About a quarter of same-sex households have children in them, compared to about 42% of all family households, according to the census in 2011. This is also not particularly surprising, given that 45% of U.S. pregnancies are unplanned. Many straight couples may end up as parents more or less accidentally, whereas same-sex couples can't really become accidental parents, so only the most dedicated to parenthood usually end up doing it. Marriage still remains a bedrock institution in American culture, but it's one that members of newer generations are perhaps expressing more ambivalence or uncertainty about than members of generations past. Only 46% of currently unmarried people said they were absolutely certain they wanted to get married in a survey conducted in 2010 by the Pew Research Group. 29% weren't sure, and the rest said that they thought they probably or definitely didn't want to marry. In keeping with the stereotype, unmarried or single women tend to express more interest in marriage than unmarried men. For example, women in the Pew data were less likely to say they definitely didn't want to get married. Only about 8% of women agreed with that statement versus 20% of men. However, it is projected that about 85% of Americans will marry eventually. As is explained in the reading, your odds of getting married are higher the more education you have and also the more money you make. People who have been previously married but then were divorced or widowed generally express less interest in getting married again once you ask them. 22% of divorced or widowed people want to remarry. And here, the gender script is flipped. Men who are divorced or widowed are far more interested in remarrying than women who are divorced or widowed. 29% of divorced or widowed men say they'd like to marry again eventually, versus only about 15% of women. This may be partially accounted for by the fact that for women, at least in heterosexual relationships, marriage often does come with that big second shift of domestic and household duties that isn't necessarily accompanied by being single. However, 64% of divorced or widowed men will eventually remarry, versus about 52% of divorced or widowed women. Marriage has come a long way from a time when it was necessary for survival, inheritance, and social legitimacy. Since couples are now more likely to see marriage as an expression of the private romantic feelings between two people, many ask the question, why get married at all? If marriage is about what you feel, they ask, what does a piece of paper, signed and stamped at the courthouse, have to do with anything? Many of the functions previously fulfilled by marriage, like establishing paternity or inheritance, have been taken over by DNA tests or written wills. In an age when having children or living together outside marriage is more common and acceptable, getting married just to save face doesn't seem to make much sense either. Declining rates of marriage, as well as changes and uncertainty about what the institution is for, have caused many people to ask, is marriage becoming obsolete? In that same Pew opinion poll from 2010, 39% of people surveyed felt that marriage as an institution was becoming somewhat obsolete or outdated. There were significant demographic differences in agreement with this statement by both race and education level. Whites tended to be the least likely to believe that marriage as an institution was becoming obsolete, whereas blacks and Latinos were more likely to agree. The more education you have, the more pro-marriage you tend to be, and the more likely you see it as a thriving institution. People with high school diplomas or less, about 45%, agreed with the statement that marriage was dying out or becoming obsolete. For people with some college, it was about 41%, whereas college-educated people were the least likely to agree. Only 27% felt that marriage was becoming obsolete as an institution. Another big change in marriage is that it's more likely to be preceded by a period of cohabitation, or living together as part of a couple in a romantic relationship without being married, what used to be called living in sin. More than 60% of marriages are now preceded by cohabitation. Less than 10% were between the years of 1965 and 1974. And almost 70% of women aged 30 to 34 have had some kind of cohabiting relationship. The average cohabiting relationship lasts about 18 months, so not all lead to marriage. Of cohabiting relationships that last, about 40 to 50% will marry by 5 years. Marriages that begin with cohabitation are slightly more likely to end in divorce, but that's probably a factor of what we call selection effect. More socially liberal people are more likely to be the cohabiting people in the first place, and there are also people who are more likely to be open to the idea or the solution of divorce if their marriage isn't working out. Why do people cohabit? Studies conducted by Eden and Kefalis in 2005 and Smook and Manning in 2012 found that cohabiting couples listed a variety of reasons. Logistics and finances were big ones. This makes sense considering that low-income couples are more likely to cohabit than high-income couples. They may do so as a solution to the high cost of living, specifically the high cost of housing. Others cite cohabitation as a way to evaluate your compatibility with someone and establish trust before you marry. Some say that they delay marriage due to a fear of divorce. This may be the case for people who have already been married and divorced, for example. Some want to be personally and professionally established so they can do it upright, throw a big wedding once they finally raise the money to do so. And women and men in cohabiting relationships often cite the fear of a loss of autonomy, feeling that cohabitation allows for a level of personal freedom that marriage, for some reason, does not. Marriage has also evolved into what Cherlin calls a capstone experience. Marriages once signaled the beginning of an adult life, the beginning of the foundation of a new household and a new relationship. It was what you had to do before you moved out of your parents' house. Now, as people marry later and later, it has evolved into what Cherlin calls a capstone experience, wherein two established adults cement a long-standing relationship, often after years of cohabitation, and in some cases, after the birth of children. Weddings have also become a lot more expensive. Back when weddings happened at the beginning of an adult relationship, happening sometimes when the couple were fresh out of high school, they were more practical, less lavish, and definitely cheaper. Now that people spend years planning and saving for their weddings, and will often delay marriage into their 20s, 30s, or even 40s, long after they are professionally established, the cost of weddings keeps creeping up. In 2012, the average U.S. wedding cost a little under $30,000, including about $1,032 for the dress, close to $2,500 for photography and videography, flowers and decor coming in at over $1,000, and so on. Weddings in the United States have become perfect vehicles for what sociologist Thorsten Veblen called conspicuous consumption back in 1899. Conspicuous consumption basically just refers to overtly or very publicly or flashily spending lots of money or displaying your wealth in order to achieve social status. Weddings provide an outlet for conspicuous consumption in that they're an opportunity for the bride and groom, and sometimes the bride and groom's parents, to showcase their financial and professional success to other people. They also establish a kind of princess for a day expectation among brides, so there's a very high expectation of perfection. They're supposed to be an expression of a couple's uniqueness. You're not supposed to have the same boilerplate wedding as everyone else. Everything from the table linens to the flowers to the cake itself in this particular photo is supposed to be heavily customized. And a lot of people assume that a lavish and expensive ceremony equals the display of love and commitment for the partners, meaning the more money you spend on your wedding, the more you're supposed to love your partner, or perhaps the higher the odds you have of staying together. By the way, that's not true. A study conducted by Emory University in 2014, which surveyed 3,000 couples who had ever been married, found that money spent on the engagement ring and the ceremony was actually positively correlated with divorce risk, meaning the more money that was spent on the engagement ring and the ceremony, the higher the couple's risk of getting divorced was. Couples spending over $20,000, for example, on their weddings, divorced at 3.5 times the rate of those who spent less. So if you opt to marry and have a big wedding, don't let anyone talk you into spending more money than you can realistically afford. Beginning a married life in deep debt isn't particularly conducive to long-term stability. In future units, we'll talk more about divorce and relationship dissolution and the kinds of risk factors that can drive your odds of making it to become one of those cute old couples who looks alike and finishes each other's sentences or not. Thank you so much for listening.